That's a big and important question. So there are a few different things that create the fundamental both causes and effects of crunch in AAA and in indie. So in AAA, generally crunch is considered more preventable for a wide variety of reasons.
Mhm.
We largely converted, most game studios converted to agile production management 10 to 15 years ago, right? With some exceptions. So as part of becoming, agile organizations that use agile production management, we're better informed about what our team's realistic velocity and output actually are. And so
Mhm.
when we give those estimates back up to our leads in AAA, we're basically saying, look, like this is realistically how fast we can go, how much content we can make, and we have to budget, 10 to 20% of our time for unexpected or unknown sort of risks that can kind of come out of nowhere, right, while making a game. Because it's always going to happen. Game development is always going to be unknowns. So the causes of crunch in AAA often come down to either an absence of robust planning and respect for what data has come out of planning, or it comes out of external dependencies. So often, a game gets behind because there's been something that, didn't work in the game, right? Like, let's say one of the fundamental design pillars just wasn't what they thought it was. It just wasn't resonating. And so maybe that team had to go back to the drawing board on that aspect of design, right? That is a big hit to the timeline that the team had tried to predict, right? And unfortunately, that can have a bit of a ripple effect across the entire game, right? Because the bigger the game, the more disruptive that type of thing will be to the entire game, right? So generally, crunch is pulled, hopefully, as the absolute last result, like emergency lever, right? Like ideally at a AAA studio, crunch shouldn't happen unless something really bad has externally impacted the team in such a way that they have to pull that lever, right? Some studios pull the lever more than others. Some studios say they don't do it, but they kind of do it under a different name, right?
Yeah.
They'll say like, oh, we really got to work harder for the next X number of weeks or months because of this unforeseen difficulty. That can turn into crunch, even if they're not calling it that, right? So, um, you know, the effects can be pretty significant. It depends on how severe the crunch is. It can be anything from, exhaustion to, I know developers who have gotten divorced because of crunch. I know people who have had a lot of family difficulty because of crunch because they were asked to stay so often for so long that it, really kind of bled into their personal life, right? That's becoming less common, thankfully, now. It was much more common 15 years ago when I started. And, that's for the better that we are attempting to avoid crunch at all costs, right? It's really devastating to the people and the industry. In terms of indie, though, unfortunately, indie often can fall victim to what is essentially crunch, but not called crunch. Um, Indies tend to, uh, unfortunately, martyr themselves in, a lot of ways in hopes that they're gonna ship their dream game. And it's tough because I think as game developers, sometimes it's very hard to separate our personal identities from our work because we're very passionate about it and we care about it. And when it's just you, or it's you and a handful of other people who are beholden to making this game a reality, that can, that overwork can creep in a little more without you noticing, because it happens usually with indies slowly over time, right? They realize they got to push a little harder, or their game, they didn't think of a system their game really needs, and now that system's got to somehow go into the game, right? So, indies tend to, because they're taking so much of that on themselves, and often they don't have a safety net of a budget as robust as a larger studio, it can be really damaging, personally and psychologically, right? So one of the things that I'm always telling students is you have to always know your personal risk aversion, right? Like a company will talk about how risk averse it is, and they're talking about like, oh, it's against our portfolio, right? But if you're an indie and your portfolio is controlled entirely by you, and it's basically it's your life, it's your livelihood, right? You need to protect yourself and your physical and mental health, vigilantly above all else, right? Because you are the person who not only has to make that call, but also has to weather whatever happens, whether the game's a success or a failure, right? And so we often tell them, can you build a safety net, right? In what ways can you build a safety net? Can you seek any forms of safe funding, right? Can you, do you have ways of working from home and offsetting costs that will allow you to have a little bit more of a safety net and cushion, so that if for some reason, right, if your game fails, that's not going to upturn your entire life and your livelihood. And so it's broadly about really understanding, do you have that safety net, right? I mean, if this was me when I graduated college in 21, I had zero safety net. It would have been terrifying for me. I had graduated with about 120 some odd $1,000 in student debt. I was like working at GameStop at the time as a third tier key holder. I think I was getting paid minimum wage and no benefits, because GameStop will keep you below the hours to allow you to accrue benefits, right? So, for me, that would have been a risk I couldn't really take, right? Like I had to be working full time. But some students are, they're not in that boat, and they find ways when they graduate that they can take the risk. So I really kind of look at it from that empathetic lens, especially having come from the background I did of knowing what it's like to live without a safety net in general, right? And living paycheck to paycheck for most of my life before I was in games.